Okay, we are now live. And let me make sure we are recording, which we are here. Well, welcome everyone. Before I introduce Emily, we just spoke about how to pronounce your last name. Tell me again.
It's Hourican.
Hourican, Emily Hourican.
Yeah, well done.
Before I introduce Emily Hourican and begin our conversation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Country Bookshop in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina. We are unique in that we are a bookstore that is part of a small community, twice weekly, award-winning newspaper called The Pilot. We are a general bookstore for kids and adults that is part of a community that chooses to shop with us and share your stories and lives with us and celebrate lovely thinking and writing like Emily has given us in this book that we will be discussing today, as well as bringing those books off the page in conversations like this. I will post a link to buy her book from us in the chat. We also have a wonderful display in the store. And now let me introduce Emily Hourican. She's the author of 5 novels: The Glorious Guinness Girls, The Privileged, White Villa, The Blamed, and The Outsider, and 1 book of nonfiction, How to Really Be a Mother. Her novel, The Privileged, was published in 2016 and became an instant bestseller. It was widely and enthusiastically reviewed and shortlisted for the Best Popular Fiction Awards at the 2016 Irish Book Awards. Her most recent novel, which we will be discussing today, The Glorious Guinness Girls, was again nominated for Best Popular Fiction Awards at the 2020 Irish Book Awards. Emily has been an editor of Himself Magazine, The Doubler Magazine, and Hospitality Ireland, and a journalist writing for the Sunday Independent, Image Magazine, Woman and Home, Condé Nast Traveler, and Time Out for over 20 years. Emily was born in Belfast and grew up in Brussels, where she went to the European school and became, for a while, fluent in being a total Eurobrat. She moved to Dublin in 1990 and studied English and history at UCD, then did a master's in English literature, also at UCD. She lives in Dublin with her husband, David, and 3 children. It is noteworthy to mention that in 2015, Emily was diagnosed with mouth cancer caused by the HPV virus and treated. She wrote extensively and very frankly about the diagnosis, treatment, and aftermath in a series of much praised diaries for the Sunday Independent. Well, welcome, Emily. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. That's such a long intro. I don't know what to say after that, but thank you for having me. I love the sound of your bookshop.
Well, if you get over on this side of the ocean, hopefully you'll be able to visit. Well, I'll dive right in. My first question is a kind of a structural question. I was wondering, at the beginning of the book, you have this great cast of characters, and at the end of the book, you have this fabulously informative author's note that really gives some context to the history. And I was wondering why you chose to put the author's note with the history at the end of the book and the cast of characters at the front of the book.
So that's actually a good question. The cast of characters, I figure, needs to go at the beginning. There are a lot of people in this book, and some of them are real people from history who lived real lives, and there's factual stuff to discover about them, and some of them are invented. And I know that when I read a book with a lot of characters, I'm awful for getting, 40 pages in and meeting a character again and going, who was that? And needing to remind myself who the person was and where they fit into the life of the main characters. So I feel that the cast of characters belongs at the beginning so that you can really quickly and easily flick back and go, oh, right, okay, that's Elizabeth Ponsonby, for example. That's a real person who was, a member of the Bright Young People in London in the 1920s. And you go, okay, now I know who that is. The author's note, then, I struggled with it a little bit, whether it should go at the beginning. And then I kind of thought that in the end, what I wanted, so the reason I wrote a novel is because I wanted to fill in with my imagination all the parts of the lives of the 3 Guinness sisters, Eileen, Maureen, and Una Guinness, because they had these very fascinating lives and were these quite fascinating women. I wanted to fill in everything that I didn't know about them with imagination and therefore it had to be a novel. And so I kind of thought, no, people need to just dive right into this novel. And then at the end, when they have taken in everything that the novel tells them, that's the place to put the more historical, accurate, non-fiction, factual account of some of the lives and the circumstances, the historical background of them. So that was kind of why, you know, we bookended it with characters and author's note, beginning and end.
You say, and you know, actually, one of the ways and reasons I enjoyed your book so much is your writing. And I've done a fair amount of these in conversations, and I'm going to quote more from your book than I have any other author conversation I have. But I'm
Wow.
actually going to start in the author's note. You said that you've woven, I'm paraphrasing this quote, actually, I won't do that in the writing, but you've woven your story around specific historic moments. And the challenge of that was to plot a story that took in these moments and made sense of them, a kind of join the dots with fiction, weaving in and out of fixed historical points. And my question is, what were the most difficult dots to connect as you're writing and plotting this story that encompasses such specific historical change?
Okay, great. I love that question. The hardest parts were the early parts. So the Glorious Guinness Girls were born more or less at the very beginning of the 20th century in Ireland, and they died. The last one to die died in 1999. So that's the very end of the 20th century. And that was, so that's the full span of the 20th century with all the incredible historical things that happen. So first of all, when they live in Ireland, there's the Irish War of Independence, there's the Irish Civil War, then they move over to London, there's the roaring 1920s, there's the Great Crash of 1930, there's the Second World War going on into the 60s and, you know, the kind of swinging 60s decade. A lot of their lives were quite well documented from the mid 1920s onwards. So for example, there's like a huge newspaper archive, the British newspaper archive. And if you look up the social pages of the British newspaper archive, you put in the word Guinness, you just come back with pages and pages and pages of results because they were everywhere. They seemed to go to every party, every ball, every lunch, every scavenger hunt, every fancy dress party throughout that whole decade and on into the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So the hardest part by far was the very early years, because there's not much information. There are these big biographies of the Guinness family, but the family is huge. And most of the biographies are much more concerned with the men, because the men are the ones who ran the brewery, who ran the banking business. You know, they were government ministers. They were involved hugely in politics, business in Ireland and in the UK. And so there's an awful lot about the men, and there really isn't very much about the women. You have very scant details of the birth dates, for example. So working out their early lives was very definitely the hardest. And to do that, I had to look to letters and diaries and biographies of other women who were born and lived at the same time as them in Ireland and in the UK, and try to piece together from those accounts what the lives of the Guinness Girls would have been.
You mentioned the Guinness men. Ernest, you made him such a steady and relatively kind character in the book. And he is very much a minor character. I mean, it is the Glorious Guinness Girls, but yeah. I was wondering why. I mean, meaning, is it from the research or why?
What I read about him, I liked him. So he was the middle son. He was one of three boys who then went on to have himself three girls. He was the middle son. He seems to have been the one, so the way things work with the aristocracy, these three boys of whom Ernest was the middle son were the sons of Lord Ivy. And the way the aristocracy works is that the oldest son gets everything, and the other two pretty much have to fend for themselves. So the oldest one gets the title, gets the biggest house, and that was his older brother became Lord Ivy in his turn. The youngest brother in Ernest's case was a very fascinating person with a very magnetic personality who was politically really important throughout the UK. And then Ernest is there in the middle, and he was probably the one who should have been given the brewery, except they all got the brewery. So the brewery was divided equally between them. And it always seemed a little unfair to me. He studied science at Oxford, and he was really interested in it, and he did most of the day-to-day running, but still he wasn't the sole inheritor of the brewery. He was one of three. I just felt sympathetic towards him. Everything I read about him, I liked. He was very interested in, mechanics and airplanes and all of that kind of stuff. And he seemed to me to be a steady and decent person. And I kind of wanted the girls to have that in their lives, because what I had read about their mother made her seem like she wasn't that person. So I think it's hard to have two parents who are difficult. And their mother seems to have been not hugely maternal. She seems to have had a lot of kind of not very well diagnosed health problems of her own. Towards the end of her life, she just never went out. By the time she died, she hadn't been seen in public in about 5 years. And you kind of wonder what's going on there. Is it all physical? Is some of it psychological? What exactly is happening? So for my characters, these three Guinness girls, I didn't want them to have two difficult parents. I wanted a steady parent if they were going to have one who was a little bit tricky to manage, as their mother seems to have been.
Yes, and that comes through in your writing, especially regarding her relationship with Una. So I'm going to read a few quotes and then ask my question. But for those of you who do listen to our chats, this is relatively unusual for me. But I want y'all to get a feel for how carefully crafted this language is. So bear with me. Let me see here. The American in her voice, more pronounced, maybe because she tried less hard to sound like Chloe, whose words came out like small, carefully contained explosions, as though she were spitting cherry stones, one by one. I said it in the new way I was practicing then, drawing out the middle of my words, then rushing to close them off at the end, just like Maureen did. But here the servants won't talk to me, and I find their accents hard to understand. Just like servants at home, they speak two languages, that of upstairs and their own, only here it's drop atches and elongated vowels, twisted like dough into strange shapes. They can be understood easily if they wish, but with me, I suppose they don't wish. Their talk is like a wall put up between us that I cannot see over. The way you write about language, it's so evocative, but I was wondering if you can talk to us as the American readers of your book about British accents and I guess Irish accents and the Guinness family, as you talk about, and other families of that type kind of float between the Irish and English society. Mm-hmm. But it's such a big dividing line of class. And I'm wondering, and it comes through very much in the novel, but just for us to have a little bit of context, could you speak to that and how it functions, both in the book and
I will. I'll do my best. It's not easy because the British class system is one of the most sophisticated and kind of, how would you describe it? It's stealthy is the best way I can describe it. So, for example, I get told in Ireland sometimes that I sound English because of being brought up in Brussels and moving over here only when I was, 18 or something. I don't exactly have an Irish accent. And sometimes Irish people think that I have an English accent. No English person ever thinks that, because the English are brought up in such a way that kind of instinctively they understand accents really, really, really clearly, even though they may not even consciously be able to say exactly what something means. They always seem to know where people are and where they stand depending on the way they talk. So there are so many words. I mean, the English aristocracy have all these really sneaky words that are spelt one way and pronounced a completely different way. And the best example I can think of is there's a college at Oxford and it's spelt Magdalene, like, Mary Magdalene of the Bible, but it's pronounced Magdalene. by anybody who knows how to pronounce it. It's just an example. So that's one
Yes.
example of the many ways. There are these little subtle ways that the English class system reinforces itself and kind of sends out these little codes to other people to see if they understand and where they stand and sit and live within the class system. And it's even more complicated then when you bring in the Irish side of that. So Ireland technically doesn't have a class system because we don't have an aristocracy. We don't have, there's no king or queen of Ireland, and there hasn't been since, we left the union with Britain and the Commonwealth. We've had no royal person at the head of our country. We have a president like you do. So because we have no king or queen, we also don't have lords and ladies and earls and, etc. Except that a lot of English people who lived here and lived in these very, very grand houses, and they were called the Anglo-Irish, which is kind of English-Irish. So they lived here and they had land and houses and titles, but their titles were English titles, and yet they lived in Ireland. So it's very, very, it's complicated. And in a way, it's archaic and doesn't matter at all anymore, except that these things do still matter more than anyone is sometimes willing to admit. And certainly at the time that the book is set, so in 1918, 1920, these things mattered enormously. Who you were and what you had were very quickly discovered and would have been really very, very obvious. Everyone would have known that the Guinness girls were staggeringly rich, and they would have known exactly who they were related to through, every side of their family, how grand the title was, how old the title was, all of these crazy little details. The whole of British society would have been really well aware of them. It was like you could have, they didn't need Google in those days because they knew all of this stuff. They passed it on down through families as these kind of, these social records. And everybody knew exactly, looking at Una Guinness, they all knew that she was an heiress. They knew exactly, what she was likely to bring to a marriage, for example, which made all three of them very attractive marriage possibilities, as you can well imagine.
You explain that actually so well.
Because it is it's hard to explain.
Yes, but as you talk about, it's little secret code signals that you send out to see if they respond, and I can see how, while it was what things were built on then, now that scaffolding is probably very much still in existence.
Yes.
I want to go into, you're talking about the girls being very attractive marriage prospects. And I love how you explain that through a scene in the book where Violet, a woman whose son is kind of making a match with a friend who she thinks is a Guinness girl, and then finds out she's not, in her reaction. But to set the scene, it seems, so the fashion that you describe, and the way you use a few pieces to create a sense of the time, and the outfits in the roaring 20s, even within the parties themselves, the sailor suits and rompers, and an outfit more tassels than dress, I think you said. Can you talk a bit about your research into the fashion and how you chose to write the pieces before we even get to the people?
Yes. So I love the fashion of the 1920s. I absolutely have always adored the very kind of the short haircut. So that wonderful kind of shingled hair, kind of, cropped very close, as short as boys. A lot of them wore it, but very beautifully waved and styled. The headbands, the feathers, the sequins, those very dropped waist gowns, it didn't work to have a waist, a bust, and hips in the 1920s. They were no good to you because the dresses all went straight down. There was no structure to them. Unless you were as thin as a rake, they probably didn't look very good. But if you were as thin as a rake, they looked amazing. And all of it, like that whole kind of jazz age scene that America had as well, kind of set around Prohibition, that exact thing was being mirrored in the UK with an awful lot of the same music. It was making its way across the Atlantic, and girls and guys in London were dancing to the very same music as people were dancing to in America. And the style would have been quite similar. If you've seen the Great Gatsby film, for example, like the Baz Luhrmann one, which I really love, the style is very much the same. And I would have been, so I read an enormous number of novels set in the 1920s when I was 15, 16, 17. I just went into this, you know, you get a craze for something. And I just had a craze for the 1920s. And I read madly everything that I could find that was set in the 1920s. And, you know, I used to spend a lot of my time imagining these parties, which always sounded like amazing fun and lots of cross-dressing. Like this was a time when suddenly, you know, the kind of society was experimenting with the idea of gender fluidity. So there were girls dressing as boys and boys dressing as girls. And it was all, you know, it was fun. I mean, older people were scandalized, but like those within the scene loved it.
I enjoyed that. I mean, it's tied into my question, but I obviously have not dove into this as deeply as you have, obviously. But the cross-dressing comes through your book, especially with Stephen and a lot of his outfits. And the scandal that there's one moment that Fliss reflects on the military jacket with the chinchilla fur around it and how that affects a veteran.
That is such an interesting, I'm so glad that you picked up on that. That's a small part of the novel, like a tiny part, but it meant so much to me because I thought that what I wanted it to do was to in some way explain where the 1920s came from, this mad burst of energy. So Stephen Tennant, who is this character who you've mentioned, so he's a real person. He was a very fascinating person. He was the model for, Evelyn Waugh wrote this amazing book called Brideshead Revisited, and Sebastian Fleisch is the main character in that book. And he is apparently modeled on Stephen Tennant. Lots of other writers also kind of referenced him in novels that they wrote because he was such a magnetic person. He was incredibly flamboyant. He was absolutely gender fluid in terms of his dress and his flamboyance and his extravagance of demeanor and personality. His older brother, so the one whose military jacket he's wearing in the book, his older brother died in the First World War. So the First World War began and ended just before this novel is set. It began in 1914 and it ended in 1918 when the Glorious Guinness Girls begins. And what happened in the First World War has so much to do with what then happened in the 1920s, because the First World War decimated the young male population of Britain, also of Ireland to some degree. All of these young men went out and they joined the army and they went to fight in Europe and they died. And Stephen's older brother is one of them. And that's a fact, you know, that's a true thing. So all of these people who were singing and dancing and laughing and dressing up and having an amazing time in the 1920s, they're all traumatized. They were all scarred by tragedy. They lost brothers, they lost fathers, they lost cousins. They lost these people. They were just too young to fight. And they had all the guilt of having been too young to fight and all the trauma of having seen the decimation of the people that they knew and their families. So Stephen is there with his brother's jacket, which is a military jacket, but he's sewn fur around the collar. And to him, I think it's a complicated way of, and that again is a true detail that I read in some biography of his that I just really loved. And so I feel that it's a tribute that he's making to his brother, but to a much older veteran, it looks like a huge insult. So there's that way in which, you know, the kind of older generation didn't understand the younger generation and were shocked at what these young, bright young things of the 1920s were doing. But they didn't see that there was also, you know, there was a tribute also. They hadn't forgotten. They were reacting to what they'd been through. So I'm so pleased that you picked up on that. It's amazing.
Well, there's so much. I mean, you use the Guinness Girls to, well, like we began the conversation with, you are connecting, using their story to connect the dots of history. And it's several other times in the book, you allude to what we all know, the pain that the Roaring Twenties is covering up, and you speak to it so well. And I mean, I almost just teared up thinking about, as you were talking, Stephen in his jacket. And I also could not help but also think of, Harry Styles' modern day is a true echo of the fashion this
Yeah.
gentleman began.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And a time of freedom as well. I mean, it would have been very difficult to be openly gay in British society before the 1920s. I mean, obviously, there were gay people, but it was much, much harder for them to be who they were publicly. And then suddenly the 1920s was like this kind of, tearing down of some of those boundaries. Obviously, it took a lot longer for it properly to come down, but it was a beginning in which people could, kind of be more themselves and be, even if that meant being different to all the starchy ways in which they would have been expected to behave by their parents. There was a lot of liberation in it.
I'm going to read a quote, and this is Maureen's mother speaking. So much change. I feel that if I don't watch out, the very chair I am seated on will be taken by you young people and turned into something else. She gives Maureen an accusing look, as if she might be personally responsible, or burned or destroyed simply because you don't like it and are strong enough to break it. And Maureen, who should soothe and reassure her, smiles wickedly and says, only if we think it is worth our while. We don't waste our energies on any old path of destruction. And as you're speaking now to the freedom that kind of came in that, it made me think of this, that it was slightly purposeful.
Yeah, I think it probably was. I think that, the more I read about it, so when I was 15 and 16 and 17 and reading all about the 1920s and reading all these books set in the 1920s, I was so dazzled by the glamour of it that I didn't see much else. I saw how much fun it was. I saw how exciting it was. Like, the primary purpose of their lives was to go to parties, to get dressed up, to look absolutely gorgeous, to go to parties and have a brilliant time. And if that meant drinking a lot and taking drugs, so be it. And they would stay up for days. And I just thought that it looked like the most glamorous thing ever. And that was all I saw. And it was that. But then at the same time, the more I looked into it, the more I began to understand it in the context of what happened before, as I say, the war and everything that did. And then what happened afterwards. Because the 1920s ended with a horrible crash. I mean, literally, the Great Wall Street crash of 1929 destroyed the fortunes of an enormous number of people in America and also in the UK. Not the Guinnesses, because their money was trade. I mean, their money was a factory. So they were okay. But the 1920s ended very, very suddenly and went into the terrible economic depression of the 1930s. So the more I looked at the 20s, it sat there like this kind of, this mad little jewel in between these two periods that were really difficult and hard and traumatic. And it looked so, I could see all the kind of trauma that resulted, that led to the 1920s, but also I could see all the real brave ways in which these young people were trying to do something different and trying for a different kind of world to the world that had led to the First World War. I don't think they succeeded, but I like the fact that, they tried in their own silly, childish ways. I mean, they were very young. And most of what they tried was probably, I mean, you can't party your way to a better world. You just can't, sadly. It would be amazing if you could, but you can't, and they didn't. But I do believe that, there was a spirit there animating them that was for a better world.
Well, and in the moment, your book bookends that so well, and obviously purposefully, with this, it does such a good job of it. and the parties and the thrill and the fun of the parties and the decadence definitely comes through. One thing that struck me though, as you're writing about the girls, is the brilliance of Maureen, especially the quickness of her mind, and how she struggled to find a place for that brilliance, and something that I was not totally aware of, having spent more time focused on kind of the American 1920s, was the scavenger hunts, and you referenced them, and I was not very familiar with them, but it seems like you use that as an outlet for her brilliance. But I was wondering if you could speak to your research and what you saw in her mind, because the quickness of her mind comes through very much in the novel.
So I found her to be particularly interesting. Of the three of them, she was definitely the one who really kind of gripped me. And the reason for that was kind of twofold. One was spending some time talking to a man who was her godson. So he knew her, he didn't know her when she was a child, but he knew her from the time of his birth, when she was probably in her 30s, and the things that he said about her. And then the other thing was tracking back. So as I say, there's much more information about all three of the girls later on in their lives, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, lots of stuff about, the Guinness girls. And Maureen, at that stage in her life, was a kind of a monstrous character. I mean, really, really snobby and quite drunk a lot of the time, until she finally stopped drinking. So cutting, so rude. Apparently she would just cut you down with, some vicious phrase and just leave you standing there destroyed with nothing to come back at her. She was obsessed with the Queen Mother. She was obsessed with her own, place in society. And she was really monstrous. I mean, there are loads of caricatures of Maureen later in life, little rhymes and poems made up about her, and about her mad love for practical jokes. She was obsessed with practical jokes. She had like a nose in the shape of a penis, a fake nose that she used to wear in the shape of a penis. And this was, to shock her guests, who would probably pretend to be shocked, to keep on the right side of her. But all of that I find really interesting. And thinking about where that person comes from, and, who is that person when they're 20? You're not a fully fledged kind of practical joking monster at 20 years old. So the kind of, the joining the dots backwards and trying to work out where the later Maureen had come from, coupled then with this man who, as I say, he was a godson of Maureen's. And he said that she was one of the most fascinating women that he ever met, that she was super smart and really had this magnetic personality. And that even though she was snobby and rude and utterly self-centered, there was still something about her that he found very, very compelling. And the intelligence, he said that, she should have been doing something else with her life other than hosting and going to parties, that she was very, very bright, and, the intelligence should have had more of an outlet. So those two things together just made me so interested in Maureen. And every time she appeared in other, a biography of somebody else that I was reading, or a letter, a selection of letters, she always seemed to have the best lines and to be funny, along with being really mean. And I just, so she intrigued me hugely.
Well, you do have to be truly mean. You do have to be pretty smart.
You do, yeah.
Yeah.
You want to know what will hurt.
Exactly. You have to think around the corners.
Yeah.
Not, but anyway, but you explain her intelligence, and understanding that context too of what most of your readers are going to know her for as they enter this novel. I see why it was so important to really focus on her brilliance, how quickly she got these complicated, and it's just one line or two lines peppered in where she would easily understand what was in the newspaper should she wanted to, but she only cared about the society pages because that's where she was.
Yeah.
So we've answered some of these things, but so back talking about Maureen, there was Eileen, the older sister. There was something where, and I will read I won't read this quote because I'm going to be reading some quotes when we talk about your language in a little bit. But there's a certain point where she accepts Maureen, and in their childhood, they are, as you write, they are combating, and where she just recognizes that once they were separated, she missed her, and it just happens, and she's never going to win. It's going to be Maureen. And was that writing Eileen and Una with such fascination and almost primary, secondary source to Maureen, was that a challenge, or how did you write the other two?
I have to say that I found Eileen the most mysterious. She is the one who, so the other thing about Maureen is that she's a middle child. And I am also a middle child. Now I have many, I've got brothers and sisters, and we're a much bigger family. I'm one of 6, but I kind of understand that middle child, that look at me. Maureen was very, very look at me. She was a complete, she just hoovered up all the attention. And I don't do that, but I kind of, I get that thing of being not wanting to be overlooked that the middle child has. Eileen, to me, I always, as I say, I find her more mysterious. Una, I think, I felt I kind of knew Una, that very kind of, that very obedient personality that sometimes the youngest can have, incredibly sweet-natured, dislikes arguments, apparently hated people, raising voices and shouting, and would duck arguments all her life if possible. She adored children and spent all her time with children as much as she could. She much preferred children to adults. She had a lot of children. She lost children. She had 3 children who died, which is incredibly sad. And then when she was really much older, she adopted more children, and she just loved to surround herself with young people. And somebody once dubbed her London's oldest teenager when she was in her late 20s, even her early 30s at that stage. So she was very, again, I felt that I had a kind of an understanding of her as a character. Whereas Eileen is there as the oldest, and she's very aloof and very elegant. She spent a lot of money on couture clothes. She would go to Paris and she would have her clothes made. She shared a taste for clothes with abdicated King's Wallace Simpson. So the king who abdicated, the reason he abdicated, Edward VIII, was because he wanted to marry this American divorcee called Wallace Simpson, and he wasn't allowed. He picked her over the throne. He abdicated in 1936, and Wallace Simpson was very thin, extremely elegant, and spent a fortune, a bunch of money on clothes. Eileen favored a lot of the same designers. She also was very elegant and spent a lot of money on clothes. I think there's a famous photo of the two of them both wearing the same dress from Givenchy in Paris. So I knew these things about Eileen, but I just, she seemed to be a more withdrawn person from her own life. So she seemed like somebody who didn't fully inhabit her own life, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Maureen might have been rude and horrible, but she was right in there living her life with all of herself. And Una was doing her very best to do that same thing, maybe finding it a little bit more difficult. Whereas I always feel that Eileen was a little bit removed from her own life, that, she was maybe 80% involved in it and not the full 100%.
There's a question about your writing process, but I'm going to lead into that. I'm going to read a few quotes of your wording, and then we can start asking about that. There's so many that I have written down here, way too many to read. Sunlight glinted on the silver knife in Eileen's hand and lit up the orange marmalade on it as though she spread her toast with sticky gold. The news that the girl's papa was back moved through the house like swallows through a barn, swift and glad until it seemed it was known in the kitchen and stables as surely as in the drawing room and the schoolroom. We returned carefully, passing from hand to hand as smoothly as though we had been news, some lip-smacking story, rather than people and dogs and trunks and hat boxes. But somehow politics intruded into that summer, snapping around us like a snare around a rabbit's foot. My time was torn into smaller shreds like a tissue, none of which seemed to belong to me. And I wanted to ask, as you're writing, are you writing these metaphors and putting them in your pocket to then bring out and pepper the story with as you're writing? I know you wrote this over years and years, but the quality of some of your writing not shocked me, but struck me as something special. And I was just wondering, to echo our participants' question, a little bit about your process there.
Well, firstly, can I say, like, I'm so delighted by how closely you read the book. Like, it is so lovely. I feel very proud to have written something that, that seems to, like, that you liked and that you read with such care. I'm just thrilled with that. Thank you so much. That is the best, the biggest compliment that anybody could pay a writer. I don't know really is the answer to that. I guess I love reading more than anything. And long before I was a writer, I was a reader. And I have always been obsessed with just that phrase that you think nails something. You're always trying to describe a moment, something that happened and what it was and what something felt like. And it's really hard, you spend your whole life chasing that and trying to do it. But I've always been obsessed with reading other people and, finding something. And finding it in any book. You can find this in a well-written thriller as much as you can find it in a Booker-winning, piece of literary fiction. But just feeling that somebody has nailed a moment, exactly what something might have looked like or felt like or smelt like, all of that I'm really interested in. And I don't know, I suppose that maybe I store them up more in the back of my head rather than written down. I do carry, little scraps of paper and notebooks and stuff around, but that's more for plot stuff, something, because you're trying to work out a plot and what happens and how you get somebody from A to B and, how you bring in this new thing that you need to happen. That's the kind of thing that I jot down because I'm afraid I'll forget it. You suddenly go, okay, if I make X do Y, then it means that B will be able to do C. That's like the kind of jigsaw puzzle pieces. Yeah. So I tend to write those down while they're in my head. If you're sitting on a bus or walking around a park or something, that might come to you and I might scribble it down. But the other stuff, no, I think it happens more as I'm writing. And, but obviously at the back of your mind somewhere, your subconscious is looking at things and noticing the way things are and how they happen and what they look like and stuff. And then
I'm going to read a few more quotes and ask again. These three have to do with some of the parties. And I have been to more than anyone's fair share of parties. Speaking of nailing something, this one, well, I will end with this one. The noise is more intense, no longer looking for an escape, but simply building and building like a closed fist. Another one, at last the band pack up and leave, and the house shakes itself free of people like a dog shaking off water drops. And then this one that just nailed it. Others are simply flinging themselves restlessly at one group and then another, taking snatches of gossip and jokes like bees take pollen, distributing it through the party so that soon everyone is covered in it, breathing it in and out. And I wanted to ask, in your bio, you refer to yourself as a brief Euro brat. And I was wondering how about your party attendance to so nail some of the
Oh,
feelings and situations.
I loved parties. I loved parties so much. I kind of miss parties. I mean, no one's been to a party in a long time, but I also don't. I mean, I have 3 children. I work a lot. I don't go to parties nearly as much as I used to, but I really did. I mean, as I say, reading all about parties in the 1920s, I spent most of my 20s very, very, very interested in going to parties and, with my sisters and just like, at that stage of your life, just as with the bright young people in the 1920s, was like their job was party going. They would spend all day preparing parties and preparing to go to parties, and then they would spend all night at parties. And I kind of, in my 20s, when I finished college and I had a job that I was maybe, I had enough energy to go out and do my job. I kind of think that maybe, that's probably how I saw my life as well. That a huge part of my life was the social aspect of it and the parties. And then the sitting around afterwards. Like, if there's one thing better than a party, it's the day after where you get to go over all the stuff and, with 2 or 3 people who you really, do this well with, and you can work out, you can get a 360 view of the party because they bring you bits of news that they saw and things that happened that you didn't notice, and you give them what you saw, and you build the whole thing all over again the next day and talking about it. And I always almost loved that more than the actual party, like the dissecting it and,
And it comes through in this when Maureen and Una come flop into bed and do that. Well, your situation about the pandemic, I'm going to kind of babble through this, but I would love to know, you and I briefly chatted about this earlier, but how you've spent your pandemic. I know you have children and a husband, but in terms of your writing life, there was a specific question about how you do write your daily pattern. And I'm wondering about that throughout the pandemic. And specifically, and there's also a question of if you've ever written poetry, because the quotes from the book I shared are so poetic, which was also noted by an attendee here.
Well, that's nice. I don't write poetry, but I did. I've won. It's a boast. It's just a boast. So just,
We're okay with that here. We're okay with that.
By the way, it's not much of a boast. I feel like, it's not a very important one. When I was at school, I was really not very good at anything to do with numbers. Awful. So maths and science and all of those things were just like, they were just dead to me. I couldn't make head or tail of them. I was quite good at English. And specifically, I seemed to be quite good at creative writing. And there was one class when I was maybe 11 or something that we all had to write a poem. And I wrote a poem that my teacher then mortified me by reading to every single class in the entire school. And there are still people from that school, so the European school in Brussels, who will every once in a while go, I remember Mr. Barlow was the name of the teacher, reading a poem that you'd written. So that was I did not distinguish myself at school academically at all, except for that one thing. But I haven't really, I read poetry and I love poetry, but I don't write it. I write too long. I'd love to be able to write, say what I mean in 14 lines would be incredible, but I haven't really, I don't do it. I think I might try and do it in the future because I think it would be interesting. But as for how I write, I've been a journalist for so long that there is no mystery around writing for me. I am, even during the pandemic when it was hard because the kids were home and we had to school them. And, it was we all know what that was like. It was kind of tough and weird and everything was unusual and nothing was what we were used to, which is always uncomfortable. We like stuff that we're used to. But even then, I just kind of, I just get on with it. I'm really boring about my writing. It's like, okay, I've got to do it. I've got X to be done by such and such a date, and I need to do it now. And I spend hours too many hours every day. And sometimes I write and it's awful. And everything I write is terrible. And I know that I'll have to go back and rewrite it because it's just appalling and I hate it. And then other days it works better. But even when you hate it, I just think you have to keep doing it. Because otherwise, you know, if you're always waiting to be in the moment and to be feeling really good about it, I don't think you just won't do it. You can't wait. You just got to crack on.
Well, so it sounds like you are Ireland, as we spoke, you know, COVID still exists, but y'all are kind of peeking out of into gathering. And, you know, today is Friday. So you were telling me that this weekend you're going to finally be social in a garden, or?
Yes, we can now. So we've had a very long period of not being allowed to see anybody at all. And then a couple of weeks ago, we were allowed to meet one other group family, like, you know, or person in a park. Now we are allowed to see a few more people in a back garden. So it's still outdoors. So there's still lots of rules around it, but it does finally feel as if everything is looking hopeful. And all the things that we kind of wondered, would we ever do them again? We now know that we will do them. The vaccination program is well underway. Everybody is being vaccinated depending on their age category, and it's all happening. And it's fantastic. For the first time, it suddenly feels as if, you know, we might get a summer in which we can move around the country, because we haven't been able to. We've been at 5 kilometers restricted to our houses for months and months and months. So it's really amazing to think that, you know, I might see something that isn't my local park for, you know, a change of scene. I'm so keen on a change of scene.
I'm so excited for you. We are a bit more rural here, but as a country, I know what the next few months is going to look like for you, and I am so excited for that for you. And I know you said you were working on a book, and I hope that as more of your books are published stateside, that we will be able to speak again, and maybe even you can come visit us in person.
I would love that.
I think you are absolutely lovely, and I really treasure your writing and your care. And I just want to thank you for doing this virtual event with us.
Well, I thank you. I most sincerely thank you. That was an amazing conversation. And I cannot thank you enough for the way you read my book. I'm so chuffed and thrilled. And I will definitely be coming over it the second I can. I'm working on the second of the Guinness Girls, so the 1930s onwards. So when that comes out, maybe in a year, maybe that's the time to come over, right?
Let's plan on it. Let's plan on it.
Let's do it.
Thank you, and enjoy your gathering.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, to everyone here, buy the book. I put the link in the chat, and it's also at the store. So read the Guinness Girls.
Please do. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye-bye.